The Novels of Charles Dickens. An introduction by David Timson. Oliver Twist. After the success of the Pickwick Papers, the reading public may well have thought that Charles Dickens was set to be a comic writer in the style of R.S. Surtees, whose character Jorrocks, a Cockney sportsman, had his antics in the hunting field recounted in many succeeding novels. But any further adventures for Mr. Pickwick and his friends were not to be, and the public were rather taken aback by Boz's next novel, Oliver Twist, or The Parish Boy's Progress, which was serialised in Bentley's Miscellany in 1837 and then published in book form in 1838. In this novel, Dickens shows fully for the first time his social conscience. He had briefly dwelt on the effects upon humanity of a debtor's prison in the Pickwick Papers, but it was the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 that sparked his anger and developed his sympathy with those it affected. This act reduced the amount of money a parish was obliged to pay to sustain its poor, and was particularly aimed at the able-bodied pauper, whom it was felt should find work and not be the responsibility of the parish. To deter such paupers, conditions in the workhouses were deliberately made harsh, and often the bare minimum of support was given to the poor, the destitute, and orphans who lived in them. This is the background to the story of young Oliver, and his struggle to escape from poverty, and what so often was the only alternative for the destitute, crime. Oliver Twist is a dark novel, and not at all like the Pickwick Papers in its tone. Its scenes of criminal brutality are mingled with others of pathos and humour. Such a wide canvas gave Dickens ample opportunity to develop his talent for vivid characterization, although at first the public did not know what to make of it. Dickens began writing Oliver Twist whilst only halfway through writing the Pickwick Papers. It shows the pressure that he would always place upon himself when producing his novels, working frantically to meet the publishing deadlines. "Sadly harassed to get it finished in time," he wrote of this novel. But that was always the case with him. Dickens worked long hours on Oliver Twist, struggling to bring into the world characters that were as real to him as himself. His dedication paid off, for it is in this novel that Dickens established his unique style, the tackling of social issues with wit and humour mixed with pathos and sadness. Oliver Twist was praised for its natural representation of everyday life and people. For the first time, ordinary working-class people could identify with the characters in a novel. And this widened Dickens's readership to all classes, making powerful and effective the attacks on social injustice that were the themes of his early work. Oliver is the first of Dickens's child heroes and heroines, who are so much associated with his writing. After Oliver came, among others, Little Nell, David Copperfield, Little Emily, Little Dorrit, and the Dombey children. Dickens himself had had a deprived childhood. At the age of 12, to help out the family income, he was made to work in a blacking factory, sticking labels on bottles of blacking used for cleaning stoves. He felt this to be a humiliation and disgrace, and this was to stay with him and inform his novels for the rest of his life. His sympathy, therefore, for the abandoned and brutalized child in early Victorian England was immense. In Oliver Twist, his ever-present memory of the blacking factory emerges in his use of one of the boys' names who worked with him there, Joe Fagin. In Oliver Twist, Dickens ironically sets up the parish workhouse, ideally a symbol of charitable support and sympathy, as a prison that deprives its young inmates of sustenance, education, and self-respect. And he presents the criminal world into which Oliver falls as providing that support, a meal of sustaining sausages, comradeship, and the learning of a trade, albeit the picking of pockets. Over this branch of the criminal underworld, the seemingly benevolent father figure Fagin presides. Fagin is sometimes presented with sly humour by Dickens, and frequently referred to as the old gentleman, a term traditionally applied to the devil himself. He is a complex character of confident evil, mixed with a neurosis about his stolen gains and a nervous expectation of being caught. He is a creation of genius, based on a real and infamous Jewish fence called Ike Solomon's, who was caught and transported in 1830. Dickens was criticised for being anti-Semitic in dwelling on Fagin's Jewish characteristics, and he toned these down substantially in later revisions of the text. Along with his more brutal creation, Bill Sikes, Dickens shows in Fagin the wretchedness and depravity of a life of crime. This is clearly expressed in the image created by George Cruikshank, the original illustrator, of Fagin as a shrunken figure with a face like a frightened cornered rat. At the climax of the novel, Sikes launches a savage attack on his wife, a powerful piece of writing that would haunt Dickens to the end of his days. He included it in his reading tours of the 1860s, performing it with such vigour and emotion that it seriously affected his health, and most probably contributed to his early death. Though good triumphs in Oliver Twist in the form of the true benevolence of Mr. Brownlow and the virtue of Rose Maylie, the vivid scenes of Fagin's underworld are the ones we remember. Oliver asks for more.
The room in which the boys were fed was a large stone hall, with a copper at one end, out of which the master, dressed in an apron for the purpose, and assisted by one or two women, ladled the gruel at mealtimes. Of this festive composition, each boy had one porringer and no more, except on occasions of great public rejoicing, when he had 2 ounces and a quarter of bread besides. The bowls never wanted washing. The boys polished them with their spoons till they shone again, and when they had performed this operation, which never took very long, the spoons being nearly as large as the bowls, they would sit staring at the copper with such eager eyes as if they could have devoured the very bricks of which it was composed, employing themselves meanwhile in sucking their fingers most assiduously, with the view of catching up any stray splashes of gruel that might have been cast thereon. Boys have generally excellent appetites. Oliver Twist and his companions suffered the tortures of slow starvation for 3 months. At last, they got so voracious and wild with hunger that one boy, who was tall for his age and hadn't been used to that sort of thing, for his father had kept a small cook-shop, hinted darkly to his companions that unless he had another basin of gruel per diem, he was afraid he might some night happen to eat the boy who slept next him, who happened to be a weakly youth of tender age. He had a wild, hungry eye, and they implicitly believed him. A council was held. Lots were cast who should walk up to the master after supper that evening and ask for more. And it fell to Oliver Twist. The evening arrived. The boys took their places. The master, in his cook's uniform, stationed himself at the copper. His pauper assistants ranged themselves behind him. The gruel was served out, and a long grace was said over the short commons. The gruel disappeared. The boys whispered each other and winked at Oliver, while his next neighbours nudged him. Child as he was desperate with hunger and reckless with misery. He rose from the table, and advancing to the master, basin and spoon in hand, said, somewhat alarmed at his own temerity, "Please, sir, I want some more." The master was a fat, healthy man, but he turned very pale. He gazed in stupefied astonishment on the small rebel for some seconds, and then clung for support to the copper. The assistants were paralysed with wonder, the boys with fear. "What?" said the master at length in a faint voice. "Please, sir," replied Oliver, "I want some more." The master aimed a blow at Oliver's head with the ladle, pinioned him in his arm, and shrieked aloud for the beadle. The board was sitting in solemn conclave when Mr. Bumble rushed into the room in great excitement, and, addressing the gentleman in the high chair, said, "Mr. Limpkins, I beg your pardon, sir. Oliver Twist has asked for more." There was a general start. Horror was depicted on every countenance. "For more?" said Mr. Limpkins. "Compose yourself, Bumble, and answer me distinctly. Do I understand that he asked for more after he had eaten the supper allotted by the dietary?" "He did, sir," replied Bumble.
"That boy will be hung," said the gentleman in the white waistcoat. "I know that boy will be hung."
Oliver meets Fagin.
Oliver was just considering whether he hadn't better run away when they reached the bottom of the hill. His conductor, catching him by the arm, pushed open the door of a house near Field Lane, and drawing him into the passage, closed it behind them. "There then!" cried a voice from below, in reply to a whistle from the Dodger.
"Plummy and Slane,"
was the reply. This seemed to be some watchword or signal that all was right, for the light of a feeble candle gleamed on the wall at the remote end of the passage, and a man's face peeped out, from where a balustrade of the old kitchen staircase had been broken away.
"There's two on ya,"
said the man, thrusting the candle farther out, and shielding his eyes with his hand.
"Who's the t'other one? And who pal?"
replied Jack Dawkins, pulling Oliver forward.
"Where'd you come from?" "Greenland. Is Fagin upstairs?" "Yeah, he's a-sorting the wipes. Up with ya."
The candle was drawn back, and the face disappeared. Oliver, groping his way with one hand and having the other firmly grasped by his companion, ascended with much difficulty the dark and broken stairs, which his conductor mounted with an ease and expedition that showed he was well acquainted with them. He threw open the door of a back room and drew Oliver in after him. The walls and ceiling of the room were perfectly black with age and dirt. There was a deal table before the fire, upon which were a candle stuck in a ginger beer bottle, 2 or 3 pewter pots, a loaf and butter, and a plate. In a frying pan, which was on the fire, and which was secured to the mantel-shelf by a string, some sausages were cooking, and standing over them, with a toasting fork in his hand, was a very old, shrivelled Jew, whose villainous-looking and repulsive face was obscured by a quantity of matted red hair. He was dressed in a greasy flannel gown, with his throat bare, and seemed to be dividing his attention between the frying-pan and the clothes-horse, over which a great number of silk handkerchiefs were hanging. Several rough beds made of old sacks were huddled side by side on the floor. Seated round the table were 4 or 5 boys, none older than the Dodger, smoking long clay pipes and drinking spirits with the air of middle-aged men. These all crowded about their associate as he whispered a few words to the Jew, and then turned round and grinned at Oliver. So did the Jew himself, toasting fork in hand.
"This is him, Fagin,"
said Jack Dawkins.
"My friend, Oliver Twist."
The Jew grinned, and, making a low obeisance to Oliver, took him by the hand, and hoped he should have the honour of his intimate acquaintance. Upon this the young gentleman with the pipes came round him, and shook both his hands very hard, especially the one in which he held his little bundle. One young gentleman was very anxious to hang up his cap for him, and another was so obliging as to put his hands in his pockets, in order that, as he was very tired, he might not have the trouble of emptying them himself when he went to bed. These civilities would probably be extended much farther, but for a liberal exercise of the Jew's toasting fork on the heads and shoulders of the affectionate youths who offered them.
"We are very glad to see you, Oliver. Very," said the Jew. "Dodger, take off the sausages and draw a tub near the fire for Oliver. Ah, you're staring at the pocket handkerchiefs, eh, my dear? There are a good many of them, aren't there? We've just looked them out, ready for the wash. That's all, Oliver. That's all."
The latter part of this speech was hailed by a boisterous shout from all the hopeful pupils of the merry old gentleman, in the midst of which they went to supper. Oliver ate his share, and the Jew then mixed him a glass of hot gin and water, telling him he must drink it off directly, because another gentleman wanted the tumbler. Oliver did as he was desired. Immediately afterwards he felt himself gently lifted onto one of the sacks, and then he sunk into a deep sleep.
Mr. Bumble woos Widow Corney.
"Oh, Mr. Bumble," cried the lady, "I have been so dreadfully put out." "Put out, ma'am?" exclaimed Mr. Bumble. "Who has dared to—" "I know," said Mr. Bumble, checking himself with native majesty. "This is them wicious paupers." "It's dreadful to think of," said the lady, shuddering. "Then don't think of it, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble. "I can't help it," whimpered the lady. "Then take something, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble soothingly. "A little of the wine?" "Not for the world," replied Mrs. Corney. "I couldn't. Oh, the top shelf in the right-hand corner. Oh!" Uttering these words, the good lady pointed distractedly to the cupboard, and underwent a convulsion from internal spasms. Mr. Bumble rushed to the closet, and, snatching a pint green glass bottle from the shelf thus incoherently indicated, filled a teacup with its contents, and held it to the lady's lips. "I'm better now," said Mrs. Corney, falling back after drinking half of it. Mr. Bumble raised his eyes piously to the ceiling in thankfulness, and, bringing them down again to the brim of the cup, lifted it to his nose. "Peppermint!" exclaimed Mrs. Corney in a faint voice, smiling gently on the beadle as she spoke. "Try it. There's a little something else in it." Mr. Bumble tasted the medicine with a doubtful look, smacked his lips, took another taste, and put the cup down empty. "It's very comforting," said Mrs. Corney. "Very much so indeed, ma'am," said the beadle. As he spoke, he drew a chair beside the matron, and tenderly inquired what had happened to distress her. "Nothing," replied Mrs. Corney. "I am a foolish, excitable, weak creature." "Not weak, ma'am," retorted Mr. Bumble, drawing his chair a little closer. "Are you a weak creature, Mrs. Corney?" "We are all weak creatures," said Mrs. Corney, laying down a general principle. "So we are," said the beadle. Nothing was said on either side for a minute or two afterwards. By the expiration of that time, Mr. Bumble had illustrated the position by removing his left arm from the back of Mrs. Corney's chair, where it had previously rested, to Mrs. Corney's apron string, round which it gradually became entwined. "We are all weak creatures," said Mr. Bumble. Mrs. Corney sighed. "Don't sigh, Mrs. Corney," said Mr. Bumble. "I can't help it," said Mrs. Corney, and she sighed again. "This is a very comfortable room, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble, looking round. "Another room, and this, ma'am, would be a complete thing." "It would be too much for one," murmured the lady. "But not for two, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble in soft accents. "Eh, Mrs. Corney?" Mrs. Corney drooped her head when the beadle said this. The beadle drooped his to get a view of Mrs. Corney's face. Mrs. Corney, with great propriety, turned her head away and released her hand to get at her pocket-handkerchief, but insensibly replaced it in that of Mr. Bumble. "The board allows you coals, don't they, Mrs. Corney?" inquired the beadle, affectionately pressing her hand. "And candles," replied Mrs. Corney, slightly returning the pressure. "Coals, candles, and house rent-free," said Mr. Bumble. "Oh, Mrs. Corney, what an angel you are!" The lady was not proof against this burst of feeling. She sank into Mr. Bumble's arms, and that gentleman, in his agitation, imprinted a passionate kiss upon her chaste nose. "Such parochial perfection!" exclaimed Mr. Bumble rapturously. "You know that Mr. Slout is worse tonight, my fascinator?" "Yes," replied Mrs. Corney bashfully. "He can't live a week, the doctor says," pursued Mr. Bumble. "He's the master of this establishment. His death will cause a vacancy. That vacancy must be filled up. Oh, Mrs. Corney, what a prospect this opens! What a opportunity for a chining of hearts and housekeepings!" Mrs. Corney sobbed. "The little word," said Mr. Bumble, bending over the bashful beauty.
The one little word, my blessed Corny.
Yes,
sighed out the matron. One more, pursued the beadle. Compose your darling feelings for only one more. When is it to come off? Mrs. Corney twice essayed to speak, and twice failed. At length, summoning up courage, she threw her arms around Mr. Bumble's neck and said it might be as soon as ever he pleased, and that he was
a irresistible duck.
In Fagin's den.
In compliance with Mr. Fagin's request, the Artful untied this bundle, which was of large size and formed of an old tablecloth, and handed the articles it contained one by one to Charlie Bates, who placed them on the table with various encomiums on their rarity and excellence.
"Sich a rabbit pie, Bill,"
exclaimed that young gentleman, disclosing to view a huge pasty.
"Sich delicate creatures, with such tender limbs, Bill, that the very bones melt in your mouth, and there's no occasion to pick 'em. Half a pound of 7 and 6penny green, so precious strong that if you mix it with boiling water, it'll go nigh to blow the lid off the teapot off. A pound and a half of moist sugar that the niggers didn't work at all at before they got it up to sich a pitch of goodness. Oh, no. 2 half-quartern brands, pound of best fresh, piece of double Gloucester, and, to wind up all, some of the richest sort you ever lushed."
Uttering this last panegyric, Master Bates produced from one of his extensive pockets a full-sized wine bottle, carefully corked, while Mr. Dawkins at the same instant poured out a wine-glassful of raw spirits from the bottle he carried, which the invalid tossed down his throat without a moment's hesitation.
"Ah,"
said Fagin, rubbing his hands with great satisfaction.
"You'll do, Bill. You'll do now."
"Do?"
exclaimed Mr. Sikes.
"I might have been done for 20 times over afore you'd have done anything to help me. What do you mean by leaving a man in this state 3 weeks or more, you false-hearted vagabond?"
"Only hearing, boys,"
said Fagin, shrugging his shoulders.
"And us come to bring him all these beautiful things."
"The things is well enough in their way,"
observed Mr. Sikes, a little soothed as he glanced over the table.
"But what have you got to say for yourself? Why, you should leave me here down in the mouth, health, blunt, and everything else, and take no more notice of me all this mortal time than if I was that here dog. Drive him down, Charlie."
"I never see such a jolly dog as that," cried Master Bates, doing as he was desired. "Smelling the grub like a old lady a-going to market. He'd make his fortune on the stage, that dog would, and revive the drama besides."
"Hold your din,"
cried Sikes as the dog retreated under the bed, still growling angrily.
"What you got to say for yourself, you withered old fence, eh?"
"I was away from London a week or more, my dear, on a plant," replied the Jew.
"And what about the other fortnight?"
demanded Sikes.
"What about the other fortnight that you've left me lying here like a sick rat in his hole?"
"I couldn't help it, Bill. I can't go into a long explanation before company, but I couldn't help it, upon my honour."
"Upon your what?"
growled Sikes with excessive disgust.
"Here, cut me off a piece of that pie, one of you boys, to take the taste of that out of my mouth, or it'll choke me dead."
"Don't be out of temper, my dear,"
urged Fagin submissively.
"I've never forgot you, Bill. Never once."
"No, I'll pound it that you aren't,"
replied Sikes with a bitter grin.
"You've been scheming and plotting away every hour that I've laid shivering and burning here. And Bill was to do this, and Bill was to do that, and Bill was to do it all, dirt cheap, as soon as he got well, and was quite poor enough for your work. If it hadn't been for the girl, I might have died."
"There now, Bill,"
remonstrated Fagin, eagerly catching at the word.
"If it hadn't been for the girl, who but poor old Fagin was the means of your having such a handy girl about you?" "He says true enough there," said Nancy, coming hastily forward. "Let him be. Let him be."
Nancy's appearance gave a new turn to the conversation, for the boys, receiving a sly wink from the wary old Jew, began to ply her with liquor, of which, however, she took very sparingly, while Fagin, assuming an unusual flow of spirits, gradually brought Mr. Sikes into a better temper, by affecting to regard his threats as a little pleasant banter, and, moreover, by laughing very heartily at one or two rough jokes, which, after repeated applications to the spirit bottle, he condescended to make.
"It's all very well," said Mr. Sikes, "but I must have some blunt from you tonight."
I haven't a piece of coin about me,
replied the Jew.
"Then you've got lots at home," retorted Sikes, "and I must have some from there."
Lots,
cried Fagin, holding up his hands.
I haven't so much as would—
"I don't know how much you've got, and I dare say you hardly know yourself, as it would take a pretty long time to count it," said Sikes. "But I must have some tonight, and that's flat."
Well, said Fagin with a sigh. I'll send the Artful round presently.
"You won't do nothing of the kind," rejoined Mr. Sikes. "The Artful's a deal too artful, and would forget to come or lose his way or get dodged by traps and so be perwented, or anything for an excuse if you put him up to it. Nancy shall go to the ken and fetch it, to make all sure, and I'll lie down and have a snooze while she's gone."
After a great deal of haggling and squabbling, Fagin beat down the amount of the required advance from £5 to £3 4 and sixpence, protesting with many solemn asseverations that would only leave him 18 pence to keep house with, Mr. Sikes sullenly remarking that if he couldn't get any more, he must be content with that. Nancy prepared to accompany him home, while the Dodger and Master Bates put the eatables in the cupboard. The Jew, then, taking leave of his affectionate friend, returned homeward, attended by Nancy and the boys. Mr. Sikes, meanwhile, flinging himself on the bed and composing himself to sleep away the time until the young lady's return.
These extracts have been taken from the unabridged recording of Oliver Twist, read by Jonathan Keeble for Naxos Audiobooks.